Hello, and welcome to another segment of the Coatesville Area Public Library's Oral History Project. I'm your host, Kirk Witmer, and I'm talking today with Mrs. Jesse Hostetter, a longtime resident of Coatesville, and in fact, a native of Coatesville. Mrs. Hostetter, good morning. It's good to have you with us today.
Good morning, Kirk. It's good to be here.
You were born in Coatesville in 1925, in the west end of Coatesville.
Right.
Born to a railroad brakeman?
That's right.
And a homemaker.
Right.
Tell us of your early memories of Coatesville.
Well, I was born on West Lincoln Highway in a single home, in an apartment, and when I was 3 months old, my parents bought a house on Charles Street. And so I was raised in that home, lived there for 21 years. I remember the church across the street being built on the corner of Hope Avenue. St. Joe's Catholic Church was being built when I was 2 or 3 years old. And I remember that construction going up. And I remember the neighbors, of course, and the store across on the corner. I think there was a store on a little mom and pop grocery store on the corner of most streets in the west end of Coatesville. And it was a good place to grow up. I had one sister who was a year older than I, and so it was just the four of us in the family. And as you mentioned, my dad was a brakeman on the Reading Railroad, and he was his mother died when he was 10, and he had a twin brother, and he had an older sister. And his father did not feel that he could handle all of these children, and he sent them out to live on farms, and they were all separated, and they didn't find each other until they became adults. So he lived on a farm where the family had girls, and the girls were allowed to go to school, but Dad wasn't allowed to go to school. He had to stay home and help with the chores. And so he only went to the 4th grade. But when he was 16, he got tired of that, lied about his age, joined the Army, ended up in the service in Texas, and eventually the First World War. He went to France with Company I division of 200 men, and he took all of the nasty jobs because he wanted to see these men come home. They had families, and he felt he had none. And out of those 200, only 3 came back, and he was one of the 3. And so eventually he found his brother who was working at Philadelphia Electric, and he found his sister. But Dad valued his family because he had a tough time as a child.
Because he had been separated from them for so long.
Yes. But, and my mom was, her mother died when she was only 3, and she was raised by her grandparents, and she was the postmistress at the Lenai post office when my dad met her, and they married and settled in Coatesville.
The Lenai post office, where was that?
Delaware County, near Media. And so, as I say, my sister came along, and then me, and I think the first thing I remember about my childhood was when I was 2 years old. I got a little Bissell sweeper for my birthday, which was in February, and I was so excited to run this Bissell sweeper, and we lost our electricity the night of my birthday, so I couldn't really see very well, but I continued to clean the carpet in the living room, and I can remember that so well. But the thing I think that I remember most is the fact that in those days, not just my family, but most families were together, Mom and Dad and whatever number of children there were. And Dad always was the breadwinner, and Mother was always the nurturing homemaker. And the kids didn't stray far from home. They played at home, played with the neighbors, played with their siblings, and they didn't have a great deal of territory to cover until they were old enough to go to school. And before school, the important thing was church activities.
You spent your early years, I guess the crash of '29 happened when you were about 5 or 6, And your formative years, as we'll call them, were right through the middle of the Great Depression.
Right.
How did that impact home life for you?
Well, actually, my father continued to work, so he had a job. But the salaries, of course, were very, very low. We were able to maintain our home. We never had problems in that regard. But we were limited in what we had, but we didn't realize it at the time. You know, when we look now at what people have, what families have, what individuals have, we had a couple of dresses and a winter coat and a sweater for the summer, and we had food on the table. So we weren't, we never considered ourselves poor. We always considered the West End folks middle class, blue collar workers. We just had a good family life, and as children, we didn't have a great deal of worries. Although I do remember the political business at the time with Hoover being in office, that there was a lot of talk about, you know, what president was going to come along and help us out of this depression. So that's pretty much the way it was. But the thing that I think I remember most is the family life of being together, eating together. Every meal you ate together, except breakfast. Dad usually had to go off before, earlier than the rest of us. But we ate together, we prayed together, we played together. And that's the saddest change I see now, because the divorce rate right now, I understand, is just about at the 50% mark. So that there's so many families where this isn't happening anymore. And even in the families where they are together, the schedules are so full that people can't even get together for an evening meal. And I think they're missing an awful lot.
Yes. Jesse, 1939, you were a young lady, all of 14 years old. There was a very special event held in Coatesville at that time. I'm referring to the 225th anniversary of the City of Coatesville celebration. Tell us what you remember of that event.
Well, the first thing I remember is that the Coatesville Record was sponsoring a contest for a young lady to be named Miss Columbia at this 225th anniversary. And it, as you mentioned, was being held at Scott Field, and at that time Scott had not been built, had been built just a few years previous to that. So this was the place that we could gather as many people from town as we possibly could. And I think everybody in town was there, actually, when this event took place. It was in the summer, and the Miss Columbia was not to be named until that night. So, and then there were others who would be, of course, her attendants. So Fonda Pyle was the one who became Miss Columbia, and she was a beautiful gal and a very nice gal too. The exciting thing about this, it was the first time that I had ever known, and up to that point, and I haven't known since, that any professional company came in to direct and put together the history of Coatesville in pageant form. And so many of our people participated with the founding of Lukens and the story of Rebecca Lukens and all of the other things that happened up to that point. And so it was just a really great celebration. And the sad thing is, I was trying to think whether there was anything special that happened at the 250th, and I can't remember that we had anything for 250, and I don't remember that we had anything to celebrate 275, but I hope in the year 2039 we will celebrate the 300.
I'm sure we'll not miss the opportunity. I know from looking at the program that accompanied that event, there were quite a number of businesses listed in the program. Coatesville must have been a thriving business place at that time.
It was. It really was. And the people in the West End, of course, walked to Main Street, which was between First and Third Avenue in the city. We walked over there to do our shopping, but both sides of the street were lined with all kinds of stores. And you could just get about anything that you want. Now, the sad thing is, there have been many times that I've gone to the mall looking for a specific item, some small thing, walked the mall, both floors, inside out, could not find what I wanted. And I would think, ooh, if we just had those stores that we used to have in Coatesville where we knew where we could go and get that particular item. So, but it was a thriving city. Of course, the mill was, a very important part of Coatesville. In fact, most of our blue-collar workers, the men from West End and East End, worked in the mill, and it was our main business, and things just seemed to be calm and peaceful, and really it was good.
Coatesville in those days was sort of, we'll say, compartmentalized. You had different parts of town that were quite distinct from one another.
They were, and as I have said, I grew up in the West End, and I shouldn't say never, I seldom heard any detrimental, can't get that out, words or remarks about the West End. But every now and then, some people in the West End would get the feeling that they were like the poor cousins, but I never felt that way. We really weren't. The housing in the West End was double homes, which now they call twins, or row houses, which now are called townhouses, and very, very few single homes in the West End of town. In the East End, of course, there was the business district, and there were, again, some row homes and twin homes. Then when we get to 10th Avenue to 13th, that was called Drumpelier. And that was where the business and professional people lived, and they had the single homes. And so we always looked at them as the rich folk. But once we got to school and we're going from one end of town to another, the children didn't see each other as being from a specific part of town. The only time we would identify the fact that we were from the West End when we would complain about walking 2 miles to school when we got to Scott, because we didn't have bus service at that time. School buses only picked up children from outlying areas like Parksburg and Pomeroy to bring them into Coatesville. But if you lived within the city limits, you walked to school wherever that was. So we found that to be no hardship. I don't think that would be the case today.
But there was still a great deal of social interaction among all the students.
Yes.
When you were in school.
Right.
What was school activities like? Did you have dances and things like that?
We did, but not a great number, not until we got to high school. I mean, now I see, 4th and 5th graders having their dances, 6th graders, and it's a regular thing these days of having dances for special occasions. But usually that was pretty much reserved for high school proms. We didn't have a great number of dances, just every Saturday night here and there. We didn't have that kind of thing. Once in a while, church youth groups might have a dance or something like that. And there was a place above Bleckman's Shoe Store, which was between 1st and 2nd Avenue, for a few years. They had a jukebox and a soda fountain, and on the way home from school we might stop up there and put on a record and have a Coke and do dancing there. So that was pretty much, but our social activities were more related to the school projects themselves, like plays, musicals, and that kind of thing.
Can you remember any of the plays that were put on when you were in school?
Well, I remember the Paint and Patch Club. I don't remember so many when I was in school, but I remember more when my children were there. My son was in Brigadoon. My kids all went to Coatesville Sky High. And I remember, of course, Jim Norton being in those plays when he was a student, and his brother John. And then later, as he became head of the English department here, he was running the show with the Paint and Patch Club. So that was an important part of football games. That was the thing. Yeah, you know, whether you liked football, I don't particularly care for football, but you know, you wouldn't miss a football game.
But football has proven to be a very integral part of the history of Coatesville. You eventually came to the end of your high school career, your senior year in high school. What memories do you have of that particular year?
Well, that was a hard year because of the war. Of course, we 1942-43 class, our senior year, was very much involved in the war effort. Many of us walked the streets at night for wardens for the air raid drills. Every home would have black curtains drawn, and we would start at City Hall on First Avenue at Greystone and leave there and go to our assigned streets and walk up and down the streets to make sure no light was showing under or around these black curtains, because we really did fear an airstrike from the enemy, and thank God that never happened. The other thing we did was we worked in at the ration boards, gas rationing at that time. Car owners were limited to gas to get to work, and that was about it. And then some food rationing with certain foods, and clothing, some clothings like shoes. You could only get maybe one pair of shoes a year or something like that. So, and then we had victory gardens and to supplement the shortage of foods.
What foods were rationed? That you can
butter
recall?
was rationed, sugar, flour, some of the vegetables themselves. At that time, you know, it was mostly canned. We weren't into the frozen food stuff yet. So sometimes the canned vegetables were a scarcity. So those were the kinds of things that were rationed. And then too, we helped raise money, or we supported purchasing war bonds, and we collected rubber and metal, and our girls, many of our girls from our senior class went into the shops to learn to do some of the things that only the fellows had been doing up to that point, and many of them after graduation ended up working in Lucan's, taking the jobs that so the fellows could be relieved to go into the military. So we missed the frills. We didn't have a senior class trip. There was a senior prom, but many of the boys who became 18 and were drafted during that year had already gone into the service, and seven of our teachers, 2 of them women, had gone into the service. So graduation itself, too, was different, because we graduated from the school auditorium. So we were only permitted 2 tickets and that was always usually mom and dad to come to graduation. And we did not receive our own diplomas. We had one member of the class, and it was usually the president, but our president was already in the Army. So our vice president received his diploma as a symbolic reception of the diploma, and then the rest of us went back to our classrooms to receive ours after. But the program itself was called the 4 Freedoms, and it was based on the drawings of trying to come up with his name. The freedom from fear, the freedom of religion. What were the other freedoms? Freedom from want.
And freedom of speech.
And freedom of speech. Help me with the name. The artist. Well, I'll come up with it at some point.
Not Norman Rockwell.
Yes, Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell. I love his paintings. I don't know why I couldn't think of it, but Norman Rockwell. So that was our program for graduation because of the situation, and we did lose or the first serviceman to die in the war from Coatesville was from our class. During the war years, when families had someone from their household serving in the military, you would see a star hanging in the window. If there was one star, that meant one member of the family was serving. In some cases, there might be 2, 3, even 4 stars. We lost a few of our classmates, but it was, we grew up fast. That's what happened. We grew up real fast that last year in school.
Out of necessity,
Yes.
I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about transportation in Coatesville.
Well, transportation, very few people when I was a kid had a car. I was 9 years old before we had our first automobile. It was a 34 Ford. And, but the one family that had an automobile before we did, the gentleman worked on the railroad with my father, and his name was Miller, Mr. Miller from Pomeroy. And he had an old Model T, and he came one time to show off his car, and it was a huge monster. But it was so strange to see this vehicle. And that must have probably been in 1930. And then by 34, we were beginning to see more automobiles. We did have bus service, but the bus service for West End people went from about West 5th Avenue to the main street between 1st and 3rd Avenue. It didn't go beyond that. So some people rode the bus to town to do their shopping, but we usually walked. So walking was the mode of transportation. The trains ran and stopped in Coatesville. So if you had to go into the city, you would take a train. Usually didn't take a bus into Philadelphia. And once a year, maybe, we would go into Philly to the big stores to do some Christmas shopping. But basically, for the most part, we were walking.
Recreation back in those days was quite a bit different, I'm sure. What did most folks do for vacation then, Jesse?
Well, first of all, we didn't get to travel a lot as far as leaving our hometown. The one thing I remember in the West End, and those of us who were Protestant, there was only one Protestant church in the West End, that was Trinity Lutheran. We had a Sunday school picnic every year at Lenape, and we would fuss for a week trying to figure out what to wear to this picnic. And Mom would pack the basket. We would walk to First Avenue and get the Reading Railroad train and go from Coatesville to Lenape on the train. It stopped right beside the park, and we would spend the whole day at the park. And then, of course, come back on the train and come home very tired. But this was an annual thing that we looked forward to. We didn't look forward to going away on a big trip every year because we knew that wouldn't happen. In fact, in our family, the biggest trip that we took outside of the state was when I was 12 years old. My dad and mother took us to Niagara Falls. They had been there on their honeymoon, and my dad, being a railroader, was entitled to a free pass once a year. We only took advantage of that one year. And so we stayed at the hotel where Mom and Dad had stayed on their honeymoon. And of course, we were very impressed with Niagara Falls, both the Canadian and the American side. But that was our big trip. Otherwise, we would go occasionally to Philadelphia to visit an uncle and aunt. And my sister and I, my dad's sister was married to a Navy man who was retired, and they lived in Overbrook, and my sister and I used to go and visit them for a week each summer. But that was the extent of vacations. Nowadays, every year, most families are fortunate enough to be able to take a trip, even if it's only for a weekend at the shore. But that was not the case. So what we didn't have, we didn't know that we were being, that
You didn't feel deprived.
we didn't feel deprived, no, at that particular time, no, we didn't, no.
Jesse, we talked earlier about a number of the businesses in Coatesville. What other changes have you seen through our community?
Well, I think the housing, for one thing. The people who lived in Drumpelier, because young people today never heard of Drumpelier. The business and professional people began to move out into the suburbs, if we want to call it suburbs. When I think of suburbs, I think of places around Philadelphia. But I think a lot of people outside the city are beginning to call the outskirts of Coatesville our suburbs. So that's one change. In the West End, I don't see a great deal of change except the Craig Ridgway School, which was my school for almost 9 years, has been demolished. And that's kind of sad. So there's no school in the West End of Coatesville. But now with the buses, that's not a problem as far as getting to children to the various elementary schools. The other thing I think that has been a big problem, which we didn't have earlier in the East End, was the building of the Oak Street project. And that has caused, us a lot of heartache. So those things are, as far as housing goes. The good thing I see that's happening in Coatesville is the work of Habitat for Humanity, because they have done and are continuing to do such great work in trying to improve housing for low-income people. And I've served on the board of Habitat as the secretary for a couple of years, and it's my favorite charity. It really is. I would support them until the end of my days, that's for sure, because I think they're doing a fantastic job.
Yes, they do provide a very valuable service, and we should be glad that they're a part of our community. You wanted to mention Mr. Hoffman.
Yes. Well, first of all, J.I. Hoffman was a member of my church, and he was the Sunday school teacher for the adult class for years and years and years. And he was a beloved member of this community. He was the secretary of the Y for a long, long time, and he took a lot of trips. There's where we got our vacations. During the winter months in the auditorium theater on Sunday afternoons, J.I. would have a presentation of a trip that he had taken. And he would talk about the trip. He would have, at that time we didn't have slides, but he would have movies of various places in the country. So our travelogue was right there, in the auditorium, and J.I. Hoffman was the one that was responsible for it.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a great person. The other thing I remember about a very important community event was during the war, when Lukens received an award from the Navy for all of their work in producing steel for shipbuilding, which was a great honor, and many dignitaries from Washington were here, and that was really a great event in the community. And then the other thing, I guess, as far as the community goes, is we've had so many championship sports teams in our high school. We should be very proud of that.
Jesse, you've talked about the number of churches that we have in our community, and there are quite a variety of them, quite a variety of religions, and each one of them seems to have its own history. What comments would you care to make about the growth of religion in Coatesville?
Well, in the West End, as I've mentioned, St. Joe's was a Catholic church that was on the corner of Charles Street and Hope Avenue. Most of my neighbors either belonged there or to St. Stan's, which was on Main Street at Church Street. And many of our neighbors were Czechoslovakian, Italian, or Polish. And I think probably there were more Catholics in the 400 block of Charles Street where I lived and Fifth Avenue than there were Protestants. But we all got along very well together simply because we didn't talk about religion. If the few times it would come up, we would have a problem with it. But thank God, since Pope Paul XXIII in his second ecumenical council opened the windows and let a little fresh air in, all of that has changed. But it was never a real problem for us. But we were separate as far as our religious beliefs and thinking and traditions went. In the east end of Coatesville, of course, there were more churches. And there are many small churches, independent. I think today I do believe that the number is over 100, which is hard to imagine.
Yes.
But the clergy today this used to be a separate thing. The ministerium was Protestant pastors getting together on a regular basis to discuss their work. Now today it's different. It's the Protestant ministers, it's the Catholic priests, and it's the black clergy and the white clergy, and things are working very well. So I think we've made a lot of progress in that regard.
Jesse, it's been commented to me that our society has changed with our architecture. We used to have homes that had front porches on them, and people would sit on their porches and they'd wave and greet passersby. But now we build homes that don't have a front porch, they have a front stoop, and we put a nice large deck on the back of the house with privacy. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's been a mistake as far as our architecture is concerned. But I can see the reason for it. With both parents working these days, there's very little time to even enjoy the deck. And people pretty much are having their own private little get-togethers, whether it's just the family or certain invited guests to spend time with them at picnic and so forth. But before moms were out working, and life was a little simpler. And we had the time in the evening, especially, of course, in the summertime, to sit on our porches, and all the neighbors sat on their porches, and we all chatted with each other. We told stories. The kids would play games, hopscotch, hide and seek, and jacks, and all these things. And we had a great time. And the house that I lived in was the end house of a row of 4. And we just felt like, one big family. And my dad was the greatest storyteller. And people would be sure and be out on their porch in the evening because my dad was always ready to tell a story. And as I had said earlier, he had a kind of a rough life as a child. But in his stories about his childhood, the things that happened to him and about the war years, he never dwelt on the problems. He always inserted an element of humor into these stories, so that you really didn't feel really bad for him. I mean, when I would stop and think about it later, I'd think, boy, Dad had it tough, and I have it so much better. But his stories never led you to that. It was just a lot of fun. And I think, that we miss out on not being able to talk to our neighbors more and have the time to do it. That's the thing, having the time to do it.
So time, or the lack thereof, is really a key feature in how our recreational activities are shaped.
Exactly. And there's so much structure and so much more to do as far as kids are concerned in the school. Because if they're not at band practice, that they're playing ball, or they're in an academic bowl, or they're just doing something else, and that kind of separates them too from the adult community.
Yes, I must tell you that I'm a little surprised to hear this comment, because now when we have things like microwave ovens and computers, I would think that would tend to give us more time. But actually, we're finding that's not really the case.
I don't think it is. No, I don't. Because I see my children raising their children and running hither and yon and having a hard time fitting, simple little things into their schedule. So I don't know whether more is better or not. Sometimes I don't think it is.
There were a number of charities in our community, and they've each had a life of their own. What do you remember about charities back in
Well, I
earlier
remember
years?
the one that was so important that thank goodness we don't need anymore is the TB Society. Of course, we need it, but it's changed. It's now pulmonary in regard to asthma-related diseases and so forth. But we had fewer charities at the Boys Town, one of the national charities, but there were fewer demands. Nowadays, and it's important with all of the research that's going on, every disease has their drive, so Red Cross Bloodmobile is one thing that's always been something that we've been involved with through the churches and schools and businesses. But sometimes it gets to the point where you have to draw the line, and usually with me it means drawing the line on something that's impacted on my life. For instance, my husband died of a heart attack, so I support the American Heart Association. People who have problems with diabetic problems, they, of course, I'm sure support that particular area. But as I mentioned earlier, Habitat is one of my favorite charities because I think they're doing such a marvelous job.
Yes, and we're lucky to have them as a part of our efforts here in Coatesville to revitalize the community.
Yeah.
Jesse, you've seen a lot of changes in our school community here as a part of Coatesville life.
Yes, first of all, in the West End, we only had the one school, and that was Craig Ridgeway, and that was our elementary and junior high school. We had no kindergarten at that time. We went to school from grade 1 through grade 9. I think the biggest thing that the kids coming into Craig Ridgeway in the first grade looked forward to was becoming old enough to participate in our Christmas caroling. You had to be in the 4th grade, and the last day of school before our Christmas holiday, we would get up at 5 in the morning, and everybody from grade 4 through 9, we would meet at the school, and we would begin to carol all over the West End, every street. And every little store, as I mentioned, so many stores on corners, they would be open, and we would wake people up with our caroling. We had a few people who were instrumentalists who would take their instruments along. And it would usually be very cold weather. And by the time we got back to the school, we'd be freezing. We would have our hot chocolate and a donut, and then we would stand in the hall wells. We had 3 floors to the school, and we would sing Christmas carols there. And so that was one thing that we looked forward to so much. When I was in the 9th grade, that was the year that Scott was being built. So in mid-semester in January, we moved to Gordon because Gordon became the junior high school and Scott was the senior high school. So we had our last half year of our 9th year at Gordon. And then we moved into Scott the next fall, and we were the first class to finish 3 years in the Scott building. We had, in junior high, we had clubs, but not the great number that we did once we got to high school. We had a newspaper, so we were very much involved in that. We had instrumentals, but we didn't have vocal groups at Ridgeway. When we got to Gordon, we did have a vocal group. But we did have a very famous music teacher at the Ridgeway, and he later went on to teach at a college.
Who was that?
And here we go again. When I should have made a note of his name. It was John. I'm sorry. his name escaped me.
It'll come.
But I did mention earlier, we walked to school. Our class sizes were about the same throughout our school term, from first grade on through high school, usually about 25 to 30 students per class. So that had not changed. But the one thing that I was interested in when I was working on a booklet for our 55th class reunion, which was held in October, looking at the number of young people who were honor students. When I graduated, 6.7% of our class were honor grads. This year's class was 16%, so that has grown. In regard to people preparing for college, only 2% in my class were taking college prep courses and expecting to go to college. And this year, 68% are going on to higher education. So, I mean, that's phenomenal to see that change. The curriculum I think in the Coatesville schools has always been good. I think we've always had top-notch curriculum. And the couple of teachers that I most admire are not even natives of Coatesville, Ross Kershey and Jerry Dager.
Hmm.
Ross Kershey, I'm sure you know, has done a history of Coatesville.
Yes.
And I'm sure you also know that when you have him for an 11th grade class, he's going to take you on a tour of the city of Coatesville. And my grandson, Mark, who graduated this past year, was so surprised when he heard they were going on a tour of the city of Coatesville. What in the world could Ross Kersey show us that we haven't already seen or don't already know? But he was quite surprised at the presentation of one very sad incident that Coatesville is remembered for, the lynching on Union Hill, which is right up the off of Church Street, which took place in the 1900s. Was a very sad event for our town, and a lot of people don't know that it even happened. And yet I had a friend who was in the waves during the Second World War, a woman in the Navy, and she was stationed on the West Coast. And when she introduced herself to someone out there and told them she was from Coatesville, they said, "Oh, you're from the town that lynched the man on the hill." And she was shocked to think that somebody out there knew about this and that we didn't. But on the other hand, in regard to race relations and situations, we also were famous for underground railroads to get the slaves up from the South. And in fact, a lot of them stayed here when they got here and worked in Lukens. So we had both sides of the coin there, the bad and the good, in regard to that. But the technology these days has expanded our curriculum so much that, and the sciences, that, when I went to school, it was unusual to go on to higher education unless you were going to teach or be an engineer. But now with my children, it was more important that they go on for further education. Now, with my grandsons, I see not only getting on with 4 years of college, but my oldest grandson, Matthew, who's going to graduate from Penn State this year, is already planning postgraduate work to continue right there. So the circle just gets bigger and bigger and bigger as far as education goes. We have more and more to learn.
Yes. And my own son, Matthew, who is one of your grandson Matthew's classmates, is also talking about graduate school for himself. So I understand what you're saying.
Well, I guess the last thing I would like to mention is that we have some blessings and we have some curses. And they're not just related to the city of Coatesville. They're national problems. National problems are national blessings. The blessings, I would say, are advantages in medical technology. I mean, people are living longer and longer and better lives. On the other side of the coin in that regard, sometimes with the use of machines and so forth to keep people alive when they're not wanted, and that's sort of putting physicians in the position of playing God with people's lives. So we have both sides of that coin. I think our big problem today with young people is our social ills, drinking, smoking, and drugs. And that sort of has increased too. When I went to school, the only no-no was smoking. And then by the time my kids are in school, it's smoking and drinking. And now by the time my grandchildren are in school, the problems are smoking, drinking, and drugs. And so that's something that covers the spectrum of the whole nation. And it's something that is causing a lot of heartache. I think we have more opportunities today than we've had, especially in job-related opportunities. And that's part of the problems of the cities. The jobs may be in the city, but the people are making so much money that they don't want to be stuck in the city, so they're able to afford to be out in the suburbs living what they consider the good life. And earlier we mentioned leisure, sitting on the front porch and talking. We had more leisure time in the old days than we have now. but we have more things that we could use, that we could take advantage of to enjoy leisure if we had the time to do it today. I think one of our blessings too is that I think for the most part we're a tolerant people, and so I think we've learned to accept one another in a much better way than we have in the past. So as far as problems in the city of Coatesville, I think it's very easy to identify the Main Street problem. Once the malls came into being, that was the downhill slide for maintaining businesses in the city. And when you have to go outside the city for your businesses, then other things start to fall. So I just think that those kinds of problems are national problems, and it takes someone with a great deal of vision to change that. And I don't know what those answers are, but I hope someone begins to come up with them. But I think we need to support Coatesville. Our reunion committee this year for our 55th reunion, we have had talked about this at great length because we've had reunions, a couple of them in the city in the early days. Then we started to go to the Maple Inn. Then we moved on to the Revere Tavern. And this year we said, you know, we need to support our own hometown. We graduated from Coatesville. We're coming back. So we had our reunion at the LGM. We had a wonderful time. We really had a wonderful time. So we have to get more people coming back to town for good reasons, and need somebody with that vision to help us revamp Main Street.
Yes. Well, we are now seeing some attempts at revitalization of Coatesville, and we can only hope that they will continue.
I hope so.
Jesse, I want to thank you for being with us today and agreeing to be a participant in our oral history project. You have certainly put some more light on Coatesville and how it has changed over the years, and I can't thank you enough.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.